Welcome to Philosophy of Action. Today I want to talk briefly about Iran. Let me make something clear from the beginning. I'm not a supporter of the Iranian regime, nor the American regime, nor any regime per se. Regimes are simply tools, they are instruments used to pursue interests, whether personal, national, or ideological. What I want to examine is something narrower and more structural. The American strikes on Iran as actions that, under the rules-based international order that America itself claims to lead. This raises serious legal and strategic contradictions and the relatively muted response from allies and even rivals. This is not a moral argument, it's an internal critique. The ultimate problem to me is that unlike previous major interventions, there was no clear public final diplomatic threshold. No explicit Iran comply by these concrete conditions by this date or we will use force. Now, international law does not formally require a public ultimatum. If you are the architect and leader of the rules-based order, however, an order built on legitimacy, compliance, and procedural justification, then clear diplomatic thresholds do matter. If you want your war to be seen as legitimate, under your own framework, you create a visible last step before the use of force. Instead, strikes occurred while negotiations were still ongoing. Very similarly, in fact, to, for example, Japan's strikes on Pearl Harbor, but to a far more extreme sense, where imagine for a minute if the Japanese, without declaring war, but threatening it of course, struck not only Pearl Harbor, but Washington, killing the president, and a bunch of other installations across the US. The Americans, when this happened to them, were furious. It was a clear violation of international law, because there was no ultimatum and no declaration of war, but now here they are doing the exact same thing to their enemies. From a signaling perspective, therefore, striking during negotiations resembles a kind of behavior that America has historically condemned. Not because the scale is, again, going back to Pearl Harbor, equivalent to it, but because the signaling logic is very similar. Because negotiations apparently don't guarantee, negotiations and restraint. And that destroys trust and the belief in the good faith negotiation of the other side. Now let's get to the core issue. The stated goal is to prevent Iran from developing weapons of mass destruction. Iran was under inspection for years, not fully compliant, not fully transparent, but still under inspection, under monitoring, and under a dispute resolution mechanism. After the strikes, however, all access for inspections was effectively cut off. So here's a structural question. If partial compliance under inspection does not guarantee security, what incentives does compliance create? Because the rules-based order America has built was supposed to operate on a simple premise. Compliance leads to security, inspection leads to stability, and transparency is a form of legitimacy. Now, of course, the Iranians weren't that transparent and they weren't completely compliant, but they were somewhat working with the system. So if some compliance no longer produces any level of security, because even if you're partially complying and negotiating, you can just be struck, then the system stops functioning. In Iraq, the intelligence used to justify the invasion was later also proven to be false. That matters not because it was malicious necessarily, but because it established that even under inspection regimes, even under declared WMD concerns, regime destruction was still possible. Now with Iran, the threshold appears even lower. There's no ultimatum, no public final conditions, no clear last diplomatic boundary. From the perspective of any external observer, this signals something very dangerous. Compliance or even engagement with the system does not guarantee any level of safety. This leads to a death ground problem. When leaders believe they may be struck regardless of whether or not they comply or not, or rather start complying or not, they will behave as if they are already cornered. They do not negotiate gradually. They do not escalate gradually. They have to either fold immediately when the Americans make a demand, like complete bending over, doing whatever they ask, which generally is not politically feasible. So the other alternative only to immediately escalate. In the short term, unpredictability can therefore increase compliance because nations can't fight America, so they have to bend over and take it. But in the long term, it increases the incentive for deterrence. If anything, this has proven that everyone needs WMDs in order to protect themselves. Look at North Korea. I'm not saying North Korea is a morally justified nation. I'm saying that their strategic logic is reinforced. The only states that the US does not strike directly are states that have nuclear weapons or are fully aligned with it. If you are not aligned and you do not possess deterrence, your security becomes uncertain, and when security becomes uncertain, deterrence becomes more attractive. Therefore, more and more nations will now be seeking to either acquire WMDs, get protection via WMDs, or immediately bend over to the Americans. But with the current American mindset, that might lead to resentment and eventually acquiring the earlier two anyway. So what does this mean? If you are a mid-level power or an aspiring regional power, and relations with the United States are deteriorating, you face a calculation. Compliance does not guarantee protection, at least partial compliance, that is. International law will not shield you at all, and the international community will not punish the rule maker either. Therefore, if you want regime survival, you either fully align or develop hard deterrence. This does not mean every country will pursue WMDs, but it marginally increases the incentives to do so. And that is how proliferation spreads, not through ideology, but through perceived insecurities. Because every 2-bit enemy of the United States will now be begging for nuclear weapons the moment they see the US looking at them, or for extreme weapons in effect, because negotiation is pointless. Because mid-negotiation your leader will come out and the US will take him out anyway. And this is where the core of my argument lays. America built and leads the rules-based international order. That order is built on predictable threshold, transparent enforcement, legitimacy through procedure, and compliance producing security. Great powers will always bend rules, but when the rule maker bends them unpredictably, the rules stop functioning as coordination mechanisms. Even if you believe in realism, even if you believe this might actually be the right thing to break this rules-based order, long-term stability still requires credible negotiation thresholds. Without them, every opponent feels like they are immediately on death ground. And leaders on death ground do not compromise. They arm themselves. So, my suspicion, I may be wrong, is this. This strike does not discourage WMD development. It increases the perceived necessity for it. Because if the lesson of Iraq was that bad intelligence by your opponent can lead to them destroying you, and the lesson of Iran is that partial compliance does not protect you either, then the lessons future leaders will draw, outside of the American sphere that is simple. Deterrence is the only way to protect yourself. And the only thing that deters the Americans is WMDs. And in a world where the rule maker violates its own framework without predictable thresholds, deterrence becomes also the only rational strategy.